morning and welcome to the first of our series of 5 virtual meetings of the Regional Policy Dialogue on Environmental Licensing and Enforcement. My name is Davis Jones. I work in the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit at the Inter-American Development Bank, and I am the coordinator of our Regional Policy Dialogue. I'm also the liaison to our co-sponsor of the series at the International Network on Environmental Compliance and Enforcement, also known as INES. Before I continue, I'd like to point out that we have interpretation available in English and Spanish by clicking on the little globe at the bottom of your screen and selecting English, Spanish, or no translation. En español, antes de todo, les indico que tenemos interpretación en la...
I'd like to remind everyone that we have simultaneous interpretation services in both English and Spanish. You can just go to the bottom of your screen and click on the globe icon and select the language that you prefer.
During our presentations, please use Zoom's chat feature and we will relay those to the speakers. Because of the size of our audience, we're not able to accept those individually. Just in case we don't have time to get to your question, please add your email address and we'll address it after the session is over. I would like to thank our panelists for making time in their busy schedules to participate in our dialogue during these challenging times, and to thank all of you for your interest. During this first of the 5 sessions, we're focusing on mechanisms for stakeholder engagement that different authorities in the region are using during the COVID-19 pandemic, including virtual consultation. We're pleased to host expert panelists from the Americas and the Caribbean to discuss efforts they're undertaking in their countries to ensure public participation in environmental and social decision-making when it is not possible to hold in-person meetings. We'll begin with brief presentations from each panelist and a few minutes for clarifying questions. After the presentations, we'll open the floor for your questions to all the panelists. Again, I ask you to relay your questions through the chat function, and we will pass those on to our panelists. Allow me now to introduce Christian Perez, who has been our facilitator for the last 3 regional policy dialogues, and he will be moderating the rest of the session. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, David. Es un placer.
Thank you very much, Davis. It's a real pleasure to welcome everyone to this first virtual meeting of the Regional Policy Dialogue, given the COVID pandemic that we are all experiencing. I wanted to just reiterate the message conveyed by my colleague David Jones regarding the questions, and we're going to ask everybody to submit your questions through the chat stream. Secondly, I'd like to discuss the structure or the format that we'll be using for this webinar. Firstly, to provide some context to this policy dialogue, we will have Joseph Maluski, the Chief of the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit of the Inter-American Development Bank, who will give us an overview for the dialogue and discuss some issues related to the context in which we're operating. Subsequently, we will have Susan Haas, who will discuss in this field. She will be followed by Juan Martinez, then Álvaro Arna and Roberto Leal from the Environmental and Social Division of the IDB, who will discuss various activities undertaken by the bank. And we will also see 2 presentations related to experiences in El Salvador by Álvaro Ara and Roberto from Mexico. We will also have a representative from Chile to discuss experiences being undertaken in Chile. Lastly, we will have Candace Thompson and Karen Watson from the Environmental Protection Agency in Guyana, who will discuss some experiences that they've had in Guyana. So with nothing further, Joseph, you have the floor. Good morning. Thank you, Christian. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with you to be able to get this session started. And I wanted to convey greetings to my fellow panelists and participants, both from outside as well as inside the bank. I hope that you are all enjoying good health. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to the first webinar of this series of regional dialogue on environmental licensing and enforcement. IDB. Our unit has as its mandate to ensure that projects financed by the bank are in full compliance with environmental and social policies, as well as providing support to executing agencies for the implementation of their responsibilities, minimizing as much risk as possible during the execution of projects. At the present time, we are facing very drastic changes, both inside as well as outside of the bank. The IDB has been working on reforms for their environmental and social policies. In addition, the quality review team that was previously a part of our ESG unit now is a part of an environmental and social risk group, which operates separately from our unit for the purpose of avoiding conflicts of interest among functional areas. But our support responsibility for countries continues to remain in place, and this dialogue is an example of that. I'd like to share a little bit about our initiative for this regional dialogue on socio-environmental licensing and enforcement policies. This dialogue is being managed by our unit and has the purpose of generating opportunities so that government agencies in the various Latin American countries and lessons learned and identify management challenges. The first dialogue was carried out in 2015 in Lima, Peru, followed by dialogues that were conducted in Panama, Brazil, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Costa Rica, and Washington. This last one in Washington in 2017 was the first in bringing together experts from both regions in a single forum. And given the success that we observed in that event, in 2019, we had our event in San Jose, Costa Rica, utilizing the same format. During this year, the coronavirus pandemic has made it difficult to put together these dialogues. Nevertheless, we know what our commitment is, and we understand the need that is present, as well as the added value of having a platform for exchanging ideas. Therefore, we developed a series of webinars that are focused on these challenges posed by the pandemic on processes related to environmental licensing and enforcement activities. In this context, we have 4 out of 5 webinars open to the public, developed under the regional dialogue framework. Today, we will have a discussion on virtual consultations by stakeholders, presenting mechanisms that are already implemented or about to be implemented by countries to be able to address participation whenever it's impossible to have in-person meetings. On June 4th, we will listen to presentations regarding enforcement of compliance of socio-environmental policies, as well as implementing social distancing and alternatives to be able to carry out environmental and monitoring inspections when a crisis prevents our physical presence. The following webinar will be scheduled for June 11th, and it will address the issue of discretion in licensing and enforcement during times of crisis, and how authorities address these challenges. We subsequently will have a meeting that relates to interactions with indigenous peoples during a pandemic. Now, these communities have limitations in access and also face exceptional dangers, such as being exposed to people who are from outside of their communities. Nevertheless, it's important for us to involve them in the decision-making process when we discuss these environmental and social issues. The last session will be scheduled for June 25th and will be an opportunity to examine our improvements in our environmental and social governance systems, as well as to learn about the changes imposed as a result of the pandemic and what we can do in the future to make our programs more efficient and more effective when we go back to normal. This is representative of agencies that focus on licensing and enforcement, as well as experts in the field. Presentations from our panelists, I'd like to respond to a question that I am frequently asked as the Environmental and Social Unit Chief. Why is the IDB as a financing institution involved with licensing and enforcement agencies that address environmental issues in the various countries in the region? It's easy to answer this because first, we have two mandates. Primarily, we finance different actions to achieve certain means, but prior to the execution of these projects, we analyze environmental and social impacts. We consider the impacts in every one of our operations, and we take part in extensive consultations with stakeholders when we deem them to be necessary. This is the same thing that applies to the role of agencies that issue permits and licenses. And our panelists from Chile and Guyana will discuss this at length. Now, during the execution of a project, we have to supervise the operation and resolve problems to avoid any complications, very much like enforcement agencies do. And we will be hearing more about this during the course of this webinar. The second reason relates to the fact that we all have the same goal, to improve lives. And in conjunction with other agencies, we're trying to promote sustainable development and reduce risks for communities in the region and in the Caribbean. So we try to establish this by setting aside and establishing standards and practices, be it through legislation or through policies that will work to protect people as well as the environment. Without this environmental governance system, our entire operation will not fulfill its mandate. And in this context, we work jointly with countries to expand and improve the effectiveness of these systems and provide regional solutions through the exchange of knowledge and experiences. So I again want to welcome you to this webinar, and I hope you have an excellent session. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joseph. In fact, these dialogues have been an excellent experience for all the participating countries because they have told us so. Now, following through with the format for this webinar, I'd like to welcome Susana Haas from the Public Participation Institute, who will share some best practices in this regard. Susana, you have the floor.
Buenos días a todos. Good morning. My name is Susana Haas-Lyons, and I am coming to you from the Vancouver, Canada area on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwantlen, Katsi, Semiahmoo, and Musqueam people. And I'm so pleased to be able to speak with you today about how to do civic engagement, how to do stakeholder engagement in this time, because things have changed. I will have some slides that I'll be walking through as I talk, and I'll make these slides available so that you're able to look at them afterwards as a resource. My work is about bringing people together to wrestle with policy choice making, and I do this at a large context, but I've done it both in the US and in Canada. And I'm also an instructor in some of the post-secondary institutions here in Canada. I wanted to start with this idea that I think is really important as we're starting to transition to into virtual consultation. And this piece is around the idea that good quality engagement follows the same principles, whether we're online or offline. And so when you start to do your engagement, to really think to yourself about, what does that mean to us? How do we articulate good quality engagement, whether it's about the content or the people or the process or any of those pieces? So I think that's a useful place to start. A second place to start is really thinking about how this work during the COVID crisis impacts how we're approaching it. And I pulled out a few different themes here. The first one is that it's important to remember that communities are not as interested in what we want to talk about a lot of the time. They're prioritizing the health and safety of their families and community members. Plus, their capacity to respond or participate may be limited because of this care and attention they need to place in other places. And secondly, so then that means we have to consider extending timelines. We might need to slow down our process, make it come back to it later, or even defer decisions if it's appropriate. I mean, sometimes we need to be making decisions without being able to do the same depth of consultation we might want to have done previously. And that means we need to keep communities informed if we're taking actions. When there's urgency, to find sensitive ways to engage. And part of that is finding the process that works. And so I'll talk a bit about that. And a key principle that I always come back to is to ask the community how it's already getting information and communicating with one another, particularly in this time, so that we are able to find out what works for them. And then lastly, we continue to assess and we respond to the current circumstances. What was right 2 months ago during the start of the crisis, at least here in Canada, as 2 months ago it started, is very different now. People have become accustomed to the lifestyle, but yet some of the economic impacts have gotten worse. So we have to be doing some of these assessments. With that in mind, when you're thinking about designing the engagement itself, I always try to think about what I call sort of first things first, which is about clarifying your purpose for engaging. So what is the opportunity for influence? And opportunity for influence could be a chance to, be able to help inform what the monitoring looks like. It could be a chance to inform where the monitoring happens. It could be all sorts of things, but that's important really to think about, why am I inviting people in? Secondly, I describe it as scope of discussion. What are we talking about? And what's on the table, what's off the table? Meaning some decisions have been made. Let's communicate that out to people. What are the decisions yet to be made? Thirdly, what do we want to get out of it? Do we want informed participants? Do we want priorities from them? Do we want a set of new ideas? That's number 3, is thinking about what are we trying to achieve. 4 is back to getting in communication with the participants themselves. What needs do they have? Do they want to participate in a deep way because it's very important to their livelihood and their values and their community and their environment? Or is it, it's something that they care about, but they're very busy. And so we need to ask that question in order to find out. And then the 5th one is about how complex is the topic and how sensitive is it? And if it's a very sensitive, like very high emotion or very high stakes conversation, we need to approach it in a different way. These 5 things together create the purpose of our engagement. And that needs to be clear way before we even think about what the tools are. One last thing about this sort of foundational piece is that you already have a lot of skills and experience. Maybe not what this gentleman is doing with the soccer ball, but or perhaps you do. But we have our experience and capacity that we bring, and you don't need to become someone else overnight. So Now, of course, when we talk about engagement online, particularly, it's useful to think about, well, how do we do that in an equitable and inclusive way? Particularly because there are real barriers to participating online. And so this model can be a useful way to think about what are the barriers that your communities may face in using digital tools. So the first one is availability. Are you engaging with people who are in remote locations where they're having to use their cell phones, or they can't even get broadband, like high bandwidth digital access? So then, but in most cases, it's not quite just yes access or no access. There's some access, but it can be through cell phones or it can be spotty. And so you have to think about the amount of data you're asking people to put through. Like, for example, this webinar is difficult to do in remote locations where you don't have a high internet speed. And then also access or availability is not just about the technology, but it's also about the language, right? Here we're doing it in English and Spanish. Are you able to do it in local indigenous languages? Are you able to provide opportunities for people who are disabled and need assistive technologies? We have to remember that digital exclusion can often amplify the existing prejudices and unequal power structures that we have in our society. Number two is about affordability, that even if you have access, it may not be affordable, and that means it can be out of reach for people on low incomes, or they may have a limited amount of data and they need to use it frugally. Awareness. Who is even aware of this opportunity to participate in the process, and how do you make sure that you're raising that awareness so that they understand that there is an opportunity and they can decide? Ability is really about thinking about what we're inviting people to do. To sit passively on a webinar like this requires one set of skills, and some of you are typing questions, which is great. But when we start asking people to do things like drag and click, or to be able to find different tools in one site, then we have to think about, are we building capacity with a stakeholder group so that they feel comfortable using these tools? And then lastly, it's about agency. It's about who feels that they have the capacity to act and bring about change in the world, and thinking about not just involving people as a passive recipient, but actually active, and can we design that way? So there's some things we can do to support this. I call this inclusive digital engagement. From the beginning, to set project goals, allocate resources, and have accountability measures for making sure that you're doing this in an inclusive way. Secondly, we often design our engagement around the biggest group that we're working with. But particularly when we're thinking in a digital engagement where there are significant barriers, it can be useful to design around the project's most vulnerable communities. And if we design something that's successful to engage the people who may have the hardest time to participate, then we know everyone else will be able to engage successfully. Number three is about paying, actually giving an honorarium or bringing into the project formal roles for organizations and community leaders to give us guidance. This is expertise. It's lived experience expertise about the methods we use, the tools we use, the images we use to represent the communities that we're engaging, the language, all of these pieces. We know the best we can, but nobody knows better than the communities we want to engage. So bringing them in and actually paying them to honor that labor. Take the time to build relationships. I think we all know this, you're doing this already. Set the tone for respectful engagement, particularly online, not so much in kind of closed spaces, but in open spaces. Online can be quite a negative environment. We all know this, particularly for people of color, for women. It can, and to invite people to ask them to share their opinion, we need to really think, how do we set the tone for respectful engagement? And the last one on the left-hand side column is to acknowledge to document and to forgive mistakes. We are going to make mistakes. We're all learning in this process, and particularly when we're trying to be inclusive, sometimes we get it wrong, and that's okay. We're all learning, but we need to actually be honest about that and then not do it again. On the right-hand side, these ideas are about asking people about what hardware do they use? Do they mostly use cell phones? Do they mostly use tablets? Are they on computers? What about their internet access? And where do they already go online? And then you can accommodate for that. You can advocate for better policies. We're going to be using digital tools in an ongoing way for the foreseeable future. And so now is the time as an organization to think about how can you advocate for better internet access so that you can have good relationships in an ongoing way with your stakeholder communities. Next is to think about minimizing the number of steps involved so that it's not a complicated process. Simplify the information, use images, diagrams, graphs, other ways to reflect complex information, and to provide all the necessary knowledge and resources about each step in the process. And then lastly is to think about not just having one way to participate, but can you have different kinds of conversation together so that people can participate in ways that make sense for them. So just a reminder, I will be sharing these slides with you afterwards, so don't feel like you need to kind of capture all of it now. The next thing is, I know people are always interested, of course, in, okay, so those are the principles then, but what are the actual tools I can use? So that's my next and final section here. So, and the reason I put online engagement is because I actually think we need to think about complementary tools. And in some ways, it's not just about using digital. And I will be providing a link to this resource. I wrote this paper 3 years ago for the International Association for Public Participation. And you'll see there's, and I have a table of different kinds of categories of different tools that are available. So you can dig into this more, and I'll provide that resource. So thinking about tools, the first one I want to point out is the telephone is a really useful tool. Now, of course, we can do conference calls, which we've all been doing, and that is something people can go into. One-on-one calls to stakeholders that aren't well represented in virtual meetings. Maybe you're doing a web meeting, and then afterwards you can follow up, or beforehand, reach out to stakeholders that are going to have a challenge to participate and bring their ideas in. A phone tree where everybody calls the contact can be useful if you're really needing to get wide. Telephone town hall. This is the picture I have here. And a telephone town hall, what it does is you can, it rapidly dials out to a list of phone numbers that your organization has, or that people who have registered to receive a call. And then when they pick up the phone, audience members receive a pre-recorded message inviting them to stay on the line if they want to participate in this telephone town hall. And once they've joined, they listen to the presentation, they can press a button to ask a question. They can also respond to survey questions or polling questions. And here you see an example of Unidos US and Telemundo partnered to host a town hall on coronavirus. And of course, phone surveys. Building on the idea of the phone, SMS is a very powerful way to engage people. So you see here in this photo, it's an image placed in a location where they are planning to do some development of a building. And so there's the question they're asking, 3 choices, and then you text your choice to a phone number. Often then it says, it doesn't say here, usually if I do something like this, I'll say, and then you'll get some follow-up questions, because once you've got them, you want to keep sending them information, and it's good to be clear about the expectation. You don't want to surprise them when you give them more questions, but you can always, as the question, then it says, reply 1 if you want to answer more questions. WhatsApp, very important, powerful tool for communicating with people, particularly in Latin America.
El WhatsApp también.
And Facebook Messenger. So then the next is email. Don't forget about that. It's important to send concise and clear information. And the piece I want to highlight here is that if you need to go beyond the people you already know are involved, make it easy for people to forward the information so that it's something that it's like you make the request and then it's easy to forward along. We've got surveys and questionnaires that you can do online or through the phone or SMS. Social media, maybe some of you are using it already. If not, think about where are your participants already spending time and then make it easy to engage. So here there's an image of the city of Vancouver using Instagram. And you can see they're doing two things here, actually three things. There's an image of an elected official who is so showing that they're like out there talking with the community, giving some information with the text. And then there's a simple poll that they can answer. There's also many different online platforms here. The city of Madrid is using their idea generation platform to ask people to give ideas about how to respond to the coronavirus. And people can add ideas, they can vote information, they can vote those ideas up or down. Don't forget about mail and print. So this is an example on the image of a postcard. There's a lot of different ways that you can get information out. Plus, you can also mail people DVDs if they aren't able to watch a video online and actually have a paper survey that they can fill out with return postage. Radio and television is a great way to go about it, particularly call-in radio programs. Maybe there's a community program that you can plug into. Then there are things like door hangers and surveys you put in people's windshield wipers, leave it behind, posters, libraries if it's open. So my last 2 points here are to think about engaging online, knowing that people want to participate in different ways, that you may have people who are just observing. That's the people you need to get information out to, who still see themselves as interested in the process. And then a large group of people who only are going to participate in a very brief way. They're going to click on Instagram, or they'll fill out a poll, or they'll use social media, or they'll kind of get involved in a bit of a WhatsApp chat. Some participants will get involved more. They'll vote for an idea, they'll comment in social media, they'll fill out a whole survey, and a few participants will participate in workshops or add new content. And you want to think about, can you design your engagement so that you have ways of engaging for people at all levels of interest? My last comment here, and thanks for your patience, is to start small and learn as you go. You don't need to figure it all out right away. Experiment and check it out. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susana. Thank you for sharing your experience and for sharing this practical advice on processes of how to engage others. I have several questions, but to wrap up, I have one question for you. And actually, you touched on this in your presentation. So my question is, how or what strategies are there to identify stakeholders?
That's such a great question. It's actually so foundational to start with knowing even who to talk to. And I think one of the key challenges can be that we have some particular contacts already, and then we can end up relying on those existing contacts. And one really important thing to do is to go out there and ask, who else should I talk to? And reach out to them. And that's, so when you, to kind of snowball that way, that's one key piece. A second key piece is to pick up the phone and talk to existing community organizations that maybe have nothing to do with environmental monitoring, but actually to, that may, for example, be in the faith community. Maybe it's the church, or it's the community that supports the seniors organization, and say, I'm doing this project around environmental licensing, if that's your project, and to say, and to ask, is there somebody who might be interested? Now, the last really important point about reaching new stakeholders is that we have to always get clear on why other people should participate. I call this the what's in it for me. And we know what's in it for us, right? We're doing this project and we need to have people giving us their input, and we know it's useful for them. We need to then frame our invitation to participate in a way that says, this is going to have an impact on your life in this way. And this is your opportunity to help influence a decision that matters to you. And then there maybe think through other motivations. Do they want to participate because they want to learn or make relationships or build their network, or have the access to information they might not have gotten otherwise? That's a really critical piece. So there's two pieces of reaching out to networks that you may not have already been connected with, and making sure your framing is around the why they should participate.
Once again, thank you very much, Susana. And at the end, we'll have time for some more questions. Now, to continue with our program, I'm now going to call on Juan Martinez. He is part of the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit at the Inter-American Development Bank, and he is going to tell us about the strategies of the bank. And then I will call on Alvaro Adam and Roberto Leal, also from the IDB, and they will be telling us about the experiences in El Salvador and Mexico. So please go ahead, you have the floor. Thank you, Christian. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to greet our audience, make sure you can hear me. I wanted to greet everyone across the Americas. We hope that you and your families are in good health. I hope that everyone is well. And as Christian just said, I am Juan Martinez. I am in charge of the social practice of the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit at the bank. And what I'm going to do, along with my two colleagues, is tell you a bit about the experience of the Inter-American Development Bank, what we have been doing in this new situation, the COVID-19 pandemic that has affected us for several months now. Basically, what I'm going to be presenting is a description of the current context. I'm going to be telling you about the projects being implemented by the bank. Also, for us, the most important criteria that need to be taken into account for preparation and implementation of projects. And also, we're going to quickly describe the virtual consultation process. The most important thing is that we're going to share with you these two experiences, one from El Salvador, the other in Mexico. As you well know, the current situation, because of the COVID-19 crisis, governments in Latin America have issued instructions limiting movement of persons, and this makes it very hard to hold face-to-face meetings. So now we have to see how we can adjust our methodologies so that we can have significant consultations, so that this adds up to a process that directly consults our stakeholders. Now, these methodologies definitely have to be in keeping with our operational policies. In no way have we changed our requirements, so we have to make relevant and significant adjustments in this process. The criteria to carry out virtual consultations, they depend, first of all, on the phase that the project is in. Is the project just being designed? Is it being executed? And a lot has to do with the impact of the project. Holding consultations during the initial phase of project preparation is not the same as once the project is being implemented. So the project's impacts will determine the scope of the consultation. Is this a project that has significant or high environmental and social consequences? If so, that will take more effort than those projects that are moderate risk or less. So both the direct and the direct and indirect impacts of the project are all important, and consultations have to be had to determine specific methodologies. Now, with the limitations that we have faced over the past few months, we know that it is hard to get full engagement of our stakeholders. As Susana just said, that means that we have to make an interesting effort. We have to look at pertinent methodologies, things that can help us use technology so as to involve these stakeholders. We need to involve them either in project preparation or project execution phases. Now, virtual consultations are an important tool to tackle issues having to do with the process of involving stakeholders. Projects always have clearly defined objectives, and the idea is that based on those objectives, we can see how consultations need to be structured. Now, virtual consultations have to especially try to engage vulnerable groups, especially those that do not have access to the tools, the technologies, the platforms that we're going to be using. Now, in the experiences that we're going to hear about, we're going to see about the different levels of effort required, and also you will see what the dynamic is to be able to do this in the countries. It's important to point out that the work done by the Inter-American Development Bank is we work with specific executing agencies in the countries, and that allows us to more clearly define what our objectives are, and we coordinate with the executing agencies as we prepare to have the virtual consultations. Now, in the case of projects that are being prepared or that are going to the Board of Executive Directors for approval, it's important that we include the instruments to prepare the environmental and social impact assessment. And it's important that we look at the different managerial tools. For example, it's important when the environmental and social impact assessment is being done, and when we are preparing the environmental and social plan, it's important that we base the consultation on these processes. Why? Because the results of the consultation have to be incorporated into these two tools that are important for the implementation of the programs financed by the bank during their implementation. Now, and this too was already mentioned, but we have to identify stakeholders, those that are relevant. First of all, the first factor is you have to identify not only who these people or who these parties are, but we have to encourage them to participate in the consultation process. We have several sectors in civil society. We have persons, groups that are going to be impacted, and also we have community organizations, community members, and here we include indigenous populations. Now, they sometimes have their own representatives, their own leaders, and this requires coordinating meetings using suitable methodologies. Susana already gave us a very broad gamut of types of technology that have been used, and we're going to see that in the two cases that we're going to hear from, you will see that they have used platforms that the national governments already have in place. And thanks to that, they were able to use these virtual methodologies. Now, in this context, the two experiences that we're going to share with you, and this has all occurred in the last 60 days, is the experience from El Salvador. Basically, it's a quality program. It has to do with be born, grow, and learn, nacer, crecer, y aprender. And then from Mexico, we're going to hear about the operating agencies for water and sanitation. So, Christian, if you agree, I will call on Alvaro. So Alvaro can begin his presentation. He will be talking about the adjustments made because of the pandemic and all of our learnings, what we are learning as we continue to develop our practice. And here we'll be talking about the environmental and social safeguards. So with that, I call on Alvaro. Thank you, Juan, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be part of this initiative. And I wanted to thank this organization for giving us this opportunity to talk about lessons learned and the virtual consultations we have had in El Salvador. First of all, just to provide you with a bit of context, I would like to tell you a bit about the scope of this program. This program is the first operation in a serial operation. The idea is to contribute to improve quality. One of the ideas is to support vulnerable children, also a digital transformation. And the third component, that is the largest one, will finance building classrooms for nursery education. We have 5 centers of excellence for young children. And we will look at the requirements for environmental evaluation or assessment. We focused on the component including rehabilitation of works, in other words, to eliminate negative impacts. We have looked at local impacts, things that can be dealt with environmental and social management techniques. And also, it's important to highlight that the lessons will not be applied until execution. So only then will we be able to see what the impact of each specific project was. For this reason, the documents that were prepared in the loan preparation phase was an environmental and a social strategic plan, and also the corresponding consultation plan. We began to do the consultations in January. We had planned to have a face-to-face consultation with a focal group of key players at the national level and having public hearings with the population that would be affected. However, the natural disaster was declared, and we had to redesign the consultation network and put together a virtual consultation format in keeping with the bank's guidelines. The virtual consultation had 2 modalities. First of all, there was a digital platform that was used to maintain the consultation with national key players. And also we had a WhatsApp and phone call effort to contact the local population. For the consultation process, we issued individual and collective invitations to different groups. And along with that invitation, we sent practical instructions on how to access the virtual consultation meeting. And we facilitated the contact both over the phone and by email to be able to address any technical problem with accessing the platform. What the virtual platform does, provided by the executing agency, was it was a Moodle platform. This is an online open code platform that is focused on collaborative learning through the different discussion fora. Now, 3 videos were loaded on the platform. Here, the National Director of Childhood Learning and others explained why the consultation was being made, the program, and then the results of the environmental and social studies carried out during the preparation of the loan. Also, we talked about the strategic, environmental, and social assessment. There was an executive summary of all this information, and also we uploaded information having to do with the scope of the program and a presentation on the bank's safeguard policies and their concrete application to this project. It's important to point out that to encourage the participation of the stakeholders, we didn't get the participation we would have liked, but hopefully that motivation on the part of a social specialist provided us greater participation. There were these leading questions that created a lot of interest amongst the stakeholders. And now I wanted to share with you the results of the consultation. The consultation period went from the 4th to the 30th of April, and we had a total of comments and recommendations, 277, and that was 70% participation, which is higher than what we had hoped for. But it is important that we heard from UNICEF, from NGOs, people specialized in education, specialized in public policy, in inclusive education. And the important thing, something that we could say about the consultation, is that 80% of the stakeholders that accessed the platform took an active part. They answered 170 questions, made comments and suggestions having to do with social and environmental studies and the program per se. Now, with this program, and here you can see what the pros and the cons were. For the Moodle platform, that was the strategic consultation, and then the WhatsApp platform and phone calls that were used for more specific consultations to those that were directly affected. Now, what were the advantages of the platform? Regarding participation, we can say that the quality was very, very good. Why? Because of the depth of the recommendations. Now, we think that this is probably because a strategic consultation involved inviting experts in the sector, people that had previous information available. And they had them, so they were able to ask questions that were very in-depth and make in-depth comments. Also, we have gotten better participation than what we usually get with a face-by-face modality, and our coverage was national. Now, regarding feedback, feedback was also timely. Now, as far as the drawbacks are concerned, there was a lack of interaction. The number of stakeholders was restricted. We had to send out invitations. And the cost, well, of course, an advantage of using a platform is that the costs are low. So now, regarding the drawbacks, again, there's a lack of interaction amongst participants, and inclusion is more limited. We could have a more dynamic forum. Perhaps that would be a lesson learned for these consultations. Although we said the participation was high, I should say that there wasn't much interaction amongst those engaged. Also, participants require access to the internet, and also they have to have some technical skills to manage the Moodle platform and to manage the documents that have been uploaded on this platform. So perhaps the most vulnerable groups don't have those skills or those tools. It's important that we provide enough time so that participants can provide their feedback. So they need some time to respond to all of these observations. Let's look at the WhatsApp calls. All of us know how to use WhatsApp by now. And the participation, the best advantage is that it's immediate and very straightforward communication. The quality of the dialogue is good, and the cost is minimal. Now, if we look at the disadvantages, the participation may not be as valuable. They do not have previous information available, and also no exposure to other points of view. Now, confidentiality, this is something that is currently being is under review. It's being assessed, but I think that now the current limitation is 4 people at most. Another thing we have to take into account is that when we say WhatsApp, we are using personal phones, and that could put at risk the confidentiality, the privacy of the user. And this is important when we talk about populations in certain areas, populations that may be especially vulnerable. Now, the platform visibility has been good. In the case of WhatsApp, there isn't all that much visibility. We're talking to a phone number. So really that does not provide for much ownership of the method. Let's turn now to the results, the feedback, which is important in this whole process. And we can say that of the 277 comments, they talked about environmental and social risks. Here you can see a drawing that illustrates the main comments received. As you can imagine, the impact, the concern regarding the impact of coronavirus in the community was the prevailing one. There were several comments on that. Also, the problem of violence having to do with maras, the gangs, and the representative risk if people have to move around and there's a presence of gangs on the street. Also, to establish a code of conduct for workers, that was a recurring theme, and to make certain that there will be access to educational centers, and to consider evacuation plans for people with disabilities. Now, all of this also had to do with access to disabled individuals, but we included other things. For example, the emergency plans. That is something that originally had not been put into the environmental and social documents. And thanks to this effort, we took that into account. Also, the idea of having inclusive education, including indigenous peoples, also promoting interculturality. And another thing, we have said that this is strategic. It's something we have to take into account. This was often mentioned, and that is that the specific consultations have to include those parties that will be affected. That could be churches, different community groups, etc. Now, to wrap up, here are the conclusions regarding this process. First of all, we can say that this type of platform can be a very good tool so that consultations will be significant. But we have to realize that we're talking at a strategic level. This was a strategic environmental and social assessment. So although this methodology is replicable, it's important that we look at each individual consultation. For example, perhaps we have to stress more making the model platform more dynamic and the interaction amongst users. An important thing is that this is not magic, but just because you're using Moodle doesn't guarantee your success. You have to make a decision case by case. A lot depends on the project, the vulnerability of the stakeholders. You have to analyze that project by project. And as we have already said, one of the conclusions is that we have to look at vulnerable persons, and there's a difficulty in reaching those vulnerable persons. This type of consultation perhaps could be managed in a hybrid manner, sometimes with face-to-face once we get back to normal, and then use this tool as a complement for those situations where we are back to normal, which we hope will be soon. So with that, I conclude. Thank you very much. And I'm going to call on Roberto Leal, who will be talking about Mexico. Thank you.
While we wait for the Mexican case to come forward, I'd like to ask our speakers to try to speak a little bit more slowly so that the interpreters can keep up with your comments. Thank you. Roberto, you have the floor. Good morning, Roberto Leal here, environmental specialist for the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you for the opportunity. Juan Martinez and my colleague Alvaro Adam. Today we're going to be sharing some of the experiences that we had in a water and sanitation project. This revolved around the integral development of operating organisms in water and sanitation in Mexico. The general objective for this project was to improve the operational sustainability as well as the financial sustainability of various water operators through the financing of integral packets and short and medium term projects for populations between 50 and 900,000 inhabitants. It was based on two components, the institutional strengthening component with an allocation of $1 million and the second studies and infrastructure component with an allocation of $99 million. And we worked with a number of operators, Conagua, which was also supported by the Internal Revenue Secretariat as well as the Environmental Protection Ministry. As I mentioned, these components were supported by these operators that carry out their functions in cities with populations between 50,000 and 900,000. We conducted a number of management training operations as well as courses. The second component involved the infrastructure studies, which involved commercial and operational efficiency, flow control, fee studies, the establishment of user registries, improvement to hydraulic infrastructure, pumping systems, energy systems, as well as efficiency teams. As you can see, most of the actions are focused on water distribution and delivery. There are other actions that focus on certain infrastructure improvements, such as the exchange of older pumps with more efficient newer pumps. In this regard, we saw an important situation as a result of the pandemic, given that the water consumption in the entire nation, as well as in other countries in Latin America, saw a spike, not only during the weekends, but during the weekdays. And so this created an excess burden for operators with the increasing demand for water, given the guidelines that were issued for more frequent hand washing. This was considered a Category B program with moderate risk level, and through the various interventions and the range of potential impacts, we conducted an environmental and social assessment. We subsequently came up with an environmental and social management plan. We tried to identify processes and plans to mitigate these impacts. And given that this is a multiple work project, we also established an environmental and social management framework. And so we used a representative sample that represents 30% of the investment. We were able to obtain approval by the board, and we subsequently were able to add some other contributors to the program. We also conducted a consultation, or came up with a consultation plan. And as I mentioned, we used a representative sample, and in this case, in order to ensure that we had the most broad representation possible, we had a number of cities in Mexico with different characteristics. We have the case of Hermosillo, Sonora, which has low availability of water given that it's located in a desert-like terrain. Same is the case for Ensenada. And you could say that the city of Jalapa, Veracruz has greater availability of water compared to these cities in the north. So we conducted our consultation plan. We had an in-person consultation scheduled for March 13 in the city of Irapuato, Guanajuato. And as a result of that consultation, we saw the subsequent declaration of emergency on March 14th due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this obliged us to move to a virtual mode. We had to conduct 6 consultations nationwide, and we were able to manage one in person and schedule 6 more through virtual platforms for the other cities using these online tools. This is the methodology that we used for the consultations. We involved different actors in the design. We have a participant directory database with guests. We prepared the agenda, the consultation materials, the protocol for the consultation, and we moved on to the significant consultation, and these could take place in person as well as virtually. And we conducted a subsequent analysis of the results. We wrote the consultation reports, and we issued reports based on the results analysis. Through the virtual mode, we had the first experience with an in-person consultation. And something that I need to highlight here is that the bank provided us with extensive technical support. We initially wanted the operator to provide the platform, be it Zoom or some other platform, but we asked the bank to provide this technical support so that we could be confident that we could transition to this new mode that had never been used before. And so the next step was to coordinate with the operator, and we established contact with a technical expert of the operator and with the bank's expert to ascertain which platform would be the best one to use. So after dealing with some technical issues, we then designed the virtual consultation. And after the virtual consultation, we would send the various presentations to all the participants for feedback and comments, and we could use other platforms such as Facebook or websites to be able to submit comments over the course of a 2-week period, be it via telephone or through their email. We established an email address to be able to receive these comments and feedback, especially in the cases of those stakeholders that did not have an opportunity to take part in the virtual consultation. So once we garnered all of the questions, we incorporated them into the environmental study. The virtual consultation process meets the significant consultation guidelines. In this case, the executing agency, as head of the process, promoted the participation for the various operators. There was a very good representation by all the relevant actors. There was a relevant presentation regarding the information related to the project. We also took attendance. The dynamic for the meeting and the consultation was excellent, and we had very good results. And we subsequently received recommendations and feedback. I'd like to mention that notwithstanding some of the difficulties that we faced, given that we were dealing with urban populations that responded to the call or the invitation, we relied very heavily on the operators to ensure active participation by all the key actors. We also had a very good participation from some women leaders, that we did not get participation from all the communities that we wanted to bring in. Now, this is the website for CONAGUA. And just briefly, the format for the consultation involved the opening remarks, presentations by all the guest speakers, a presentation of the project by the executing agency, presentations from the various expert groups, Q&A session. We had a total of 190 participants, some from the operator, some from interest groups, members from CONAGUA, bank consultants, and other specialists. We had 36.3% women and the rest men participating in the consultation. These are some images of the screens during the virtual consultation. And among the advantages, what we observed was that this could be easily replicated. Once we get accustomed to these types of mechanisms, then there's more confidence in using this as a tool, and there's a greater push to involve more key actors. We adapted to the rhythms of each participant. There's a greater availability of information that's presented prior to the event, and people also were provided with the presentations after the fact so that they were able to delve into the information more deeply. We were able to conduct technical tests, which facilitated the process. We have contact information, a telephone number, and email address for subsequent feedback and consultations. And as my colleague Alvaro mentioned, there are other voices that can participate through these means. Many people could perhaps have disabilities or something that make it inconvenient or impossible for them to attend in-person consultations, but they were able to take part through this modality. In terms of disadvantages, there are interested parties that were restricted due to their lack of access to technology. The rules of courtesy were a bit problematic because people were not really giving other people the courtesy of finishing their remarks. So on occasion, we did have a bit of a debate that was not scheduled or planned. We didn't achieve instantaneous participation in some circumstances because, again, many of the participants live in rural areas. So this is a Category B project with very key impacts. Some of the risks were deemed to be manageable, and we had the environmental impact assessment as well as the other assessments that allowed us to present the impacts and the risks and the prevention and mitigation measures. CONAGUA has a long history of working with institutions that facilitate the establishment of agreements as well as relationships with other organizations. These operating agencies have different degrees of development, but they do have the institutional capacity to head or lead the process, and especially more so once they've established relationships with users and other organizations. So we're trying to expand our invitations to other key actors to take part in future consultations in order to afford them the opportunity to express their concerns and recommendations. And some of the operators located in large urban centers, given some limitations in their various cities, do have some type of access to technology. So we worked extensively with these operating agencies along with the experts from the bank to try and bring about this entire process in a successful way. Thank you, Juan and Roberto.
I have a question I just received. It is, do virtual meetings require more staffing to support this process? So that's the question for Juan and for Roberto. Alvaro, do you want to go first? Yes. Here in the case of El Salvador, we were lucky. we used the digital platform of the executing agency. So the platform was already available and it was customized for the virtual consultation. But it's an open source platform, so it's low cost. But what you do need is you need to have a person there to make its use dynamic. The person that helped us set this up was there for the Moodle consultation. It didn't require any additional specialists, but it's important if you're going to use this type of technology to put in the terms of reference that there has to be a specialist available, a person who is familiar with the use of virtual platforms. But in our case, no, we had to incur no additional cost because the executing agency already had that platform available. So there was no logistic burden. Christian, basically it talked about assigning an environmental or social specialist on the part of the bank. The important thing is that you make good use of the platforms that already exist in the executing agencies of these programs and also their professional staffing. Thank you. Thank you for that very good practical example. Now, to follow our order, I'm going to call on Paola Bausare, who is the head of the Environmental Assessment and Citizen Participation Service of Chile's Environmental Service. So, Paola, please go ahead. Hello, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you for inviting the Environmental Service to take part in this forum. I don't have a presentation, but I wanted to tell you a bit what we have been doing, what our citizen participation has been like in Chile. The Environmental Service carries out an assessment of environmental projects. And Chile has always had a platform where projects are assessed in environmental terms. This is an online platform, completely transparent. The owners of the projects upload the project, and when the evaluation service sees the project, it can be seen by all of our citizens on the web page. There is no information that isn't made available. All of the evaluation process is completely transparent. Now, having said that, during the times of COVID, we too have faced some problems, and that is where we have been working. Here in Chile, our quarantine began back in March. So that means that for 2 months, we have been experiencing the situation. And in those 2 months, we have been working hard to find a way to improve our outreach. Because as I said, our service is 100% online, but that is from the technical standpoint of evaluation. That is where we upload the projects and reports. That is where the service asks its questions. That is where the environmental agencies of the state also ask questions. But in order to encourage citizen participation, we have a methodology where we have seen to date 3 types of situation. One, we can go door to door in remote areas, or we have open houses in areas that are small, where people have poor connectivity, or we have workshops. What do I mean by workshop? I mean a large workshop with a meeting of 50, 100 individuals, depending on the type of project. So that was the type of meeting we could convene. Just to give you an idea about this, about citizen participation in the environmental service is so good that we have had responses to citizen consultations. Just on one project, we have had 10,000 pages responding to the questions, 10,000 pages of an environmental impact assessment responding to the questions that we received via citizen consultation. That shows how important these projects are to our citizens. So citizen participation in terms of the environmental assessment was working, and I was meaning up until 2 months ago, where we could have face-to-face consultations, reaching as many people as possible. And there we had very good feedback. We had a lot of consultations, questions being asked. But now the door-to-door methodology can continue to work, because this is basically a situation where one person can go to one household, deliver information. That's a methodology that could continue to work. Now, an open house, understanding that there might be information available if someone wants to attend, that's another option. But the option of workshops basically is currently off the table. And that's where we realize that we have an opportunity to improve on what we were already doing, because the workshop format that we liked now makes us think that we have an opportunity to reach more people than we were reaching before. And to that end, we have been working in different ways. Something that we're doing is we have talked to our government agencies about the information we have available. And in Chile, we have a telecommunications organization, and they have information on all of the connections in Chile. That would be Wi-Fi, AM, local radios, community radio stations, SMS. So with that information that already exists in Chile, we know what towns or villages have no connectivity. So we want to reach our citizenry, but we have to step up our efforts to reach these people who live in areas where there is no connection. So in that scenario, we have already identified those areas that have and do not have coverage, and how we can reach different communities in the country. Something else that we're doing in parallel is we're looking at the work done internally in this evaluation service. You know that Chile is a long, skinny country. So the difference between the 16 different regions of the country is tremendous. The northern region requires covering big distances to consult communities. There are communities live far apart. And then in the southern part of Chile, there are a lot of places that to seek out face-to-face citizen engagement, it takes us 4 days to reach the place where the meeting has to be held. Because you have to take a barge, then you have to wait a day, then you have to perhaps take a Jeep. So the logistics really weren't all that straightforward. Also, I wanted to tell you that today we're thinking that a change in methodology could be an opportunity and allow us to reach all of the people that perhaps in the past we weren't reaching. We're also looking for financing options because, as you know, right now it's hard for governments to have funds available for this purpose. But For us, it's tremendously important to be able to develop this methodology. And the truth is, we are close to being able to develop it. We're working with internal groups. We're also doing testing with different technological tools that we have available. And that's because we need equality for all citizens. If we were to only launch an online participatory methodology, we couldn't reach all of the people that we need to reach. We have to make certain that everyone can access this in conditions of equality. So we cannot just use a technology like the one we're using right now, where we can all connect. But a lot of people cannot do this. Now, we have other ways of reaching people. This is what we did pre-COVID. And also we realize that we can use their technologies, the technologies that the isolated communities in the country use. For example, community radio stations. Often those are small radio stations, but that's what they use. Sometimes the radio broadcast reaches 40 or 50 households, and that is how they know what is happening in the world. That is how they connect. So we have to, in that way, get an accurate picture of what is happening in our country. And so we can reach everyone, not only those that have access to connections. Now, just to give you an idea of what we've been doing to date, with our environmental assessments, there are 540, 550 projects that are under environmental assessment. So once the quarantine was put into place in Chile, what we did was we suspended those projects that required citizen engagement at that exact point. Now, it's a 60-day period given for citizen consultation. So those projects that required stakeholder consultations had to be suspended. They had to be put on hold because we knew that we could not do a technical assessment without hearing from our citizens. So we have those projects, the 540, 550 projects, and about 50 from that group have had to be put on hold. So we know that soon we're going to have a new methodology to provide for citizen participation. That doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to process the ones that we were already working on, but it is an alternative. It is an opportunity to improve and to allow us to reach people that before we had not been able to reach. We think that this can be done. We have to do a lot of work. We have to work with our citizens to see what their feedback is, whether or not they like these new modalities. A lot of people may not. So we have to see how we can reach those people. Now, in the door-to-door system, for example, we have always listened to and explained to each household that this is a project, and we tell them what the project is all about. We give them information. Now, in households where there is no technology, perhaps we could proceed in that way. And also we have to look at the way in which we reach them with a more straightforward explanation, but perhaps technology could help us deliver videos or a clear, simpler description of the project. Now, often that is something we didn't do in workshops, but I think I can communicate with others, thinking that this might be the best solution. And we see that this tool gives us another solution. We can present technological tools that are available, And then lastly, one final point I wanted to make is that our platform always had the option of allowing our citizens to use our tools. So citizen consultations have always been possible by using our platform. People register, they are registered, and then on the web, they can upload their consultation. So they do their upload, they ask their questions, etc. Now, using it in that way hasn't always assured massive use. We keep statistics and we see how many people have actually used the platform, how many people are using paper, and most of our comments, assessments are received on paper. So even though this tool was available, it really wasn't used by citizens. So that too is a challenge for us to see how we can reach our citizens in that way. Now, that doesn't mean, as I was saying, that we're not going to use other modalities. And we have some ideas. Perhaps we could have a place where we could continue to receive paper-based comments, although Chile is engaging in paperless efforts. That's something that we're working on, trying to be more and more digitized. But there are also people that have problems with changing the methodology. So perhaps we could have that possibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. I wanted just a brief answer to a question that somebody submitted. And in terms of citizen participation, these proposals for citizen participation, is that submitted by the operator or by the agency? Well, in our case, whenever we see a project for environmental assessment, we look for ways to reach out to our citizens, and we look at the available technology and the different types of presentations. And so the leaders of these projects chime in with recommendations or ideas. And sometimes they come up with new ideas to be able to come up with these methodologies. But in terms of citizen participation, this is something that we are in charge of. And I don't know if you know this, but the financing for an entire environmental assessment is supported by the government. These projects do not have any cost attached, especially when they submit an application for an environmental assessment. Thank you, Paola, for your presentation. I think we've gone a little bit past our time, but now I'd like to yield the floor to Ernest Thompson and Karen Watson from the Guyana Environmental Protection Agency, who will share some of their experiences that they've had during the COVID-19 pandemic. Please go ahead, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Candace C. Brower Thompson, Senior Environmental Officer at the Environmental Protection Agency, Guyana, and I will be sharing this presentation jointly with my colleague, Ms. Karen Watson, who is also a Senior Environmental Officer at the Environmental Protection Agency. So the Environmental Protection Agency, Guyana, is the lead regulatory body for environmental management in Guyana, and some of our functions include issuing of environmental authorization, compliance monitoring and enforcement, response to environmental complaints, public awareness of course, and development of regulations. So the presentation that we'll be delivering this morning is relative to the development of our national policy on the ban of single-use plastics. So we're going to be speaking specifically to the virtual consultations we would have been conducting as it relates to the impending single-use plastics ban. Just to provide you with an overview of the presentation, as I mentioned, the ban is on the presentation is on the proposed single-use plastics ban. We're going to be sharing some of our communication approaches, as well as the categories of stakeholders we would have engaged with thus far, and those that we intend to engage with, some challenges, as well as recommendations. The Environmental Protection Agency is very grateful for this opportunity to share our experiences, as well as to learn from the experiences of others. So the proposed ban is on the importation, manufacture, distribution, and use of single-use plastic bags, plates, cups, utensils, straws, and food containers in 2021. The original date for implementation was January 2021. However, when the implementation plan was crafted, of course, we didn't anticipate that we would have the COVID-19 pandemic, which would have, of course, shifted our plans. Initially, we thought it would have been insensitive to engage in public awareness on a plastic ban, given that we're facing an international crisis, and persons are challenged in different ways. Nevertheless, we would have developed a virtual communication strategy, because our initial communication plan for the consultation would have captured some elements of virtual interaction. But of course, given that we were forced to discontinue physical engagement, we would have revisited that plan and develop a plan specifically to intensify our virtual engagement. And basically the objectives of that plan are to capitalize on what we would anticipate to be the increase in participants on social and other media, given the restrictions that most persons are confined to their home, as well as to create awareness and better understanding of the ban and the products to be banned, and to garner greater public participation for the implementation of the ban. And of course, we wanted to evoke, creativity and stimulate greater public interest. So as it relates to our communication approach for the virtual consultations, what we did initially was virtual networking. We did an inventory of the virtual platforms for our partners, our key stakeholders, the government agencies, the private sectors, the NGOs, so that we could build that network, and we would have been able to channel our communication, our publications which were developed through them for them to share on their respective platforms. We would have also decided on what is the most appropriate technologies that are available for us to reach our target audiences. And for outside of our social media and radio and TV, we needed to find a platform that worked so to conduct our specific consultation. And we have chosen the Zoom platform. So we would have been conducting consultations via Zoom. We've also conducted virtual meetings, and those meetings were originally intended to target the influencers or the leaders within the respective sectors to garner their support and for their assistance in mobilizing the relevant stakeholders. So for example, the stakeholders in the tourism sector, we would have contacted the head, the president of the Tourism Association to have meetings with him and to get his feedback so that we can get his assistance in mobilizing the stakeholders within his sector for the upcoming consultation. We would have also implemented or added a single-use plastic platform to the Environmental Protection Agency's website, so that the information pertaining to single-use plastics and the ban could be readily available to members of the public. And of course, we would have increased the publication of our notices as it relates to the ban in the daily newspapers. as well as our media networking. So we have an ongoing relationship with the media. However, we would have expanded that because we have various regions in Guyana that has different radio and television stations. So we would have built our media network in a similar manner that we did the virtual networking for the agencies to share information with the media for them to disseminate to the various populations and communities within their respective regions. We would have conducted as well prior consultations. So we have an idea of what some of the concerns are. So we would have developed publication in as it relates to frequently asked question booklets, so questions that persons would have on single-use plastics, on the ban that we would have garnered from our previous consultations. We would have answered those in a user-friendly booklet, as well as infographics. So the information is disseminated in increments in the form of infographics to the public using our various social media platforms. We are in the process of developing a single-use plastic documentary. However, and that is one of the challenges that we face, some of the materials that required external support with the media personnel and the resource personnel being restricted in their work, we were unable to get some of these materials. So the documentary still needs to be developed. However, the media are restricted in terms of their interaction, and they would need some amount of engagement with the public to do that, as well as the ads that we are developing for the band. We would have also done posters, which we would have shared electronically, but we also have them printed to be placed at strategic places, supermarkets, uh, organizations, and so on. And we have on our, as a part of our virtual consultation as well, a single-use plastic jingle, and analyzing our situation and being sensitive to the current crisis, we have up to defer the jingle to a bit later down in the year, given the nature of a jingle and the type of energy and so on that it would garner. We opted to defer that to later down in the year. We have intensified our social networking. So of course, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We tested Facebook Live, and we did that one for Earth Day, and given the great feedback that we would have had, there were a lot of questions and concerns and the need for more public awareness and so on, and the need for more engagement, direct engagement with the agency. So we would have increased the number of those interactions that we will be having. So we have another Facebook Live session on the 3rd of June, and we're intensifying the frequency of those as we analyze our different tools. We're also engaging in digital Google advertising, and those are the pop-up ads that would target specific stakeholder groups. And of course, we have radio quiz, we have radio interviews, as well as television interviews. We have those on a weekly basis, radio and television. And as I mentioned earlier, we try to disperse those some more to make contact with the regions, especially the rural communities that don't have reliable internet access, that they will be able to get the information. And of course, we're conducting we have moved our survey to acquire our quantitative data to the online platform. So we are conducting our surveys electronically as well. Um, We still have a challenge with the surveys being done electronically because of course the internet issue. Many of the areas, especially the vulnerable communities, may not be able to access it readily. And there is the text message blast. So this one we're actually going to be doing for the first time. Is the SMS message. We're working with the two major telephone companies to have those strategic messages sent to approximately 100,000 persons at a given time. So those are some of the mechanisms that the agency would have been using to interact with our stakeholders. The next slide is just to give you an idea of some of the materials that we would have developed. So two of the key questions that we get, what are the items to be banned, as well as what are the alternatives? So our posters or initial posters that we would have produced targeted those two questions, the items to be banned and the alternatives. Because what we would have found from our initial engagements is that persons, they're not opposing the ban. However, they want to ensure that for the items that are proposed for the ban, there are viable alternatives available and accessible, and it's also cost effective. And just to give you an idea of our engagement, so we would have conducted 14 Zoom consultations thus far. We started our Zoom consultations on the 9th of April. So we would have engaged with the tourism sector, the major financial institutions in Guyana, as well as some of our international partners, UNDP, UNEP, WWF, World Wildlife Fund. We would have also engaged with the private sector as well as the manufacturing sector. And stemming from all these targeted engagements as it relates to the stakeholders who would directly be impacted by the ban, we have had several other requests for the engagement in the respective sector. So the private sector, for example, they have they have subgroups in the various regions, and they are now going to mobilize those subgroups and invite us to deliver those presentations. So the final slide for me is just to give you a analysis of our consultations thus far in terms of our radio interviews, TV interviews, pub consultations via Zoom. We would have been posting information, as I mentioned, on social media, as well as writing bi-weekly articles within the newspapers. We would have done 2 news spread for the 2 major environmental observances that have passed, Earth Day and International Day for Biological Diversity. And so all these are mechanisms that we're using to engage with the public. And for all the consultations that we would have had thus far, there is always that need and that cry for more public awareness. And given that the stakeholders have been, receptive, and they're encouraging us to disseminate more information and to provide more platform for public awareness, that in itself is giving us impetus to move forward with the process. Because initially we thought that it may be better to halt the process until things reserve to normalcy. However, we recognize that it's also an opportunity for us to really explore other platforms and amplify other ways of disseminating information. So that's it for me. I will now hand you over to my colleague, Ms. Watson, who will continue with the presentation. with the presentation.
Yes. Yes. Um, just to quickly continue from where Candace stopped off. Of course, I think I can safely say that many countries, including Guyana, were not adequately prepared for the challenges or the changes that the COVID crisis would pose to in the carrying out of our functions as regulatory agencies. And in that regard, as it relates to virtual communication, Guyana has its own unique challenges with regards to successfully and effectively carrying out virtual communications. And of course, one of them includes unreliable internet and electricity. We only have one power company in Guyana, and many a times the power supply is not reliable or sustainable. And in that regard, of course, the internet access is affected due to lack of power. So that's one challenge we're currently facing. Navigating the media platform, it's new to many persons who are using it, including us regulators, more so persons, the common man in the street, who would now have to learn and unlearn certain things and to, engage us effectively. And as for us to get the appropriate response, even in the frequency of response we would want, it would require a certain level of understanding and experience in using the media platform. So another challenge is actually navigating the platform. The media platform, the virtual communication platform, could pose an issue in terms of limited interactions, given that persons are not accustomed to engaging or interacting with the regulator in this manner. So because of the newness of the technology, we've had limited interaction in terms of having the required feedback we may want from an engagement, right? And in terms to time restriction is an issue on the platform, given the funds that may be required to access the time or the extensive time that would be needed to really engage over a long manner. So our issues include funding, right? Given that we were not really prepared for the crisis, and of course, essentially the challenges posed with regards to how we would engage the public in a crisis. Finally, in terms of recommendations in how to address crises that may occur in the future, because of course we don't live in a perfect world, and these things will happen. So I think policies from the government level would need to be implemented to temporarily address issues that would arise in terms of how we would engage the public, in terms of how we would effectively carry out our functions as regulators, and also to see how persons can comply and engage with us from that level. We would need technologies to support virtual communication. Zoom is just one technology. We need to become more au fait with what other technologies are out there. And we would need to have permanent and frequent virtual engagements. I don't think at the end of this COVID crisis that we should just end or stop virtual communication. I think it needs to be a continued and sustainable means of engaging persons and stakeholders who may not readily be available to come into us and to interface with us physically. So I think there needs to be permanent and frequent virtual engagements even after we would have returned to normalcy. So with that, I want to thank you for allowing us to just share our experiences from the EPA and Guyana standpoint on what we're doing currently in the midst of this crisis. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Candace y Karen. Desafortunadamente, por el tiempo que tenemos.
Thank you, Candace. Thank you, Karen. Unfortunately, we are short on time, so we're trying to group our questions, and we're going to try to contact panelists directly. Davis will put up his email so that he can channel the questions in different directions. Unfortunately, we have so many questions, we don't have time to cover them all. Now, today we heard best international practices, key criteria when carrying out citizen consultation. Also, we heard about experience from different countries, El Salvador, Mexico, and Guyana. And generally speaking, we have heard a lot about the challenges that countries face in a situation like the current COVID-19 pandemic. I wanted to thank all of our panelists. I thank them for their efforts and for having found time to be available for this program. And with that, I'm going to call on our coordinator. Davis, would you please provide us with some ending remarks? Thank you, Christian. I want to thank everyone who took part.
I have pasted my email into the chat box and welcome your questions that we did not get answered. I will forward those to the speakers and we'll get back to you. I would also like to remind you all that this is the first of a continuing series, and we will continue this next Thursday at the same time to discuss how we do inspections, supervision, fiscalización when there are limitations on travel, on interacting with individuals. So how can we use remote methods to ensure compliance? Again, thanks to all of our speakers and all of the participants, and we look forward to hearing from you next week. And finally, you should be getting invitations to the next webinar later today, so watch your mailboxes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.